Elias Vance came to the isolated lighthouse seeking peace, but his loyal dog, Ghost, began to act strangely. In the quiet solitude of the old tower, he relentlessly clawed and whined at a single floorboard. At first, Elias dismissed it as nothing. But the desperate urgency in Ghost's eyes compelled him to look closer, and what he uncovered beneath the floor was not just a forgotten secret, but a legacy that could cost him his very life. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The last 60 miles were the hardest. The steady rhythm of the highway had given way to the winding two-lane roads of coastal Maine, arteries that twisted through dense forests of pine and granite. Elias Vance kept both hands on the worn leather of the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Beside him on the passenger seat, Ghost sat as still as a statue, a sentinel carved from smoke and silver. The only movement was the twitch of his ears, swiveling to catch the unfamiliar sounds of the deep woods. Elias glanced at his companion. Ghost was a 6-year-old German shepherd, but his coat was a rarity, a cascade of sable gray and pale white that gave him an ethereal, wolf-like appearance. His amber eyes, usually soft and intelligent, were now keenly alert. He was a calm and steady soul, a mirror to the man Elias strived to be, but the dog felt the tension humming beneath his owner's skin. Ghost had been with him since the last tour, a four-legged anchor in the turbulent sea of his return to civilian life. That life was now packed into the bed of his aging Ford pickup truck, covered by a tarp that flapped noisily in the wind. Every box, every tool, every memory. He had sold the house, a cramped suburban box with a small yard that had started to feel more like a cage than a home. The noise of the city, the friendly but hollow greetings from neighbors, the sudden slam of a car door that could send his heart into a frantic hammering rhythm, it had all become too much. He had sold it all for a promise, a whisper of peace carried on the salt spray of the Atlantic. Elias was a man in his late 40s, tall and lean with a strength that was more wiry than bulky. His brown hair, cut short in the way he'd kept it for 20 years, was threaded with silver at the temples. His face was a map of his life, rugged and etched with lines of worry, but his blue eyes held a deep, quiet kindness that hadn't been extinguished by what he had seen. He was a former signals intelligence specialist for the Marine Corps, a man trained to find patterns in chaos, to listen to the silence between the words. Now, all he wanted was the silence itself. The town of Point Judith appeared suddenly, a small collection of weathered buildings huddled around a harbor filled with lobster boats. He pulled up to the small real estate office, the paint peeling from its sign. Mr. Henderson, a man whose tired suit seemed to have absorbed the salty air of the coast, handed him a heavy brass key without much ceremony. "She's all yours," Mr. Henderson said, his voice raspy. "Been empty a long time. Hope you know what you're getting into, son. By the night. Obing goid sama way, id moment ikon no." Elias just nodded, the weight of the key in his palm feeling more significant than any legal document. He drove through the small town and onto the spit of land that led to his new property. The road narrowed, the asphalt crumbling at the edges. And then he saw it. The lighthouse stood on the farthest point of the cliff, a lonely pillar of weathered gray stone against the bruised purple of the evening sky. It wasn't grand or picturesque like the ones on postcards. It was stark, scarred by a century of storms, its lamp dark and hollow. The land around it was not large, just a windswept acre of tough grass and jagged rock that plunged into the churning sea below. It was both majestic and desolate, a monument to endurance. He cut the engine. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind whipping past the truck and the distant roar of the waves. He felt a profound sense of coming home, a feeling that had eluded him for years. This place didn't offer comfort, it offered solitude. It didn't promise happiness, it promised a quiet battle he could understand. A battle against the elements, against decay, against time. "Well, Ghost," Elias said softly, his voice thick. "What do you think?" The dog whined, a low note of uncertainty, and nudged his hand with a cold nose. "The first night was a campaign of essentials. Elias unloaded a mattress, a cooler with food, a gas stove, and a lantern. The air inside the keeper's cottage at the base of the lighthouse was thick with the smell of dust, salt, and disuse. But as he lit the lantern, casting a warm golden glow across the bare wooden floors, a sense of calm settled over him. He sat on the mattress, eating a cold sandwich, and watched the last light fade from the sky through a grimy window. The rhythmic crash of the waves on the rocks below was a powerful, cleansing sound. It was a sound big enough to drown out the noise in his head. For the first time in a long time, Elias felt a flicker of peace. But Ghost did not share his relief. While Elias felt the tension bleed out of his shoulders, the dog seemed to absorb it. Ghost refused to lie down on the blanket Elias had spread for him. He paced the small room, his claws clicking softly on the floorboards. He would stop at the door, sniffing at the crack at the bottom, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Then he would move to the window, staring out into the impenetrable darkness, his body coiled and alert. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured, reaching a hand out. "It's just us here. Just the wind." Ghost came to him, allowing his head to be stroked, but his body remained stiff. He licked Elias's hand once, then immediately resumed his patrol. His ears were constantly swiveling, tracking sounds Elias couldn't hear, or perhaps sounds that weren't there at all. He wasn't just exploring a new space, he was on guard. He was sensing something that the vast, peaceful roar of the ocean was hiding from the man. As Elias lay back on the mattress, the sound of the sea, his lullaby, he couldn't shake the image of his loyal friend, a silver phantom pacing in the lantern light, vigilant against a threat only he could perceive. The peace he had felt just moments before was now tinged with a familiar, cold unease. Dawn broke over the Atlantic, painting the churning gray water with strokes of pale pink and orange. Elias was already awake. He had slept in fits, the unfamiliar sounds of the old house and Ghost's lingering restlessness keeping him on the edge of awareness. Now, with the first light, came a sense of purpose. Work was a language he understood. It was a structured, logical process with a tangible result. It was therapy. He began with the keeper's cottage, attacking the years of neglect with the discipline of a soldier preparing his barracks for inspection. He swept away thick blankets of dust that rose like ghosts in the morning light, scrubbed grime from the windows until the ocean view was startlingly clear, and checked every floorboard and wall for signs of rot or water damage. Ghost stayed close, his earlier anxiety replaced by a quiet attentiveness. The dog seemed to understand that this physical reclamation of space was important to the man's state of mind. For Elias, every sweep of the broom, every repaired hinge, was an act of pushing back the chaos that threatened to live inside his head. By afternoon, the small cottage was clean, organized, and habitable. His gaze turned to the tower. It stood silent and imposing, a vertical challenge. Taking a deep breath of the cold, salty air, he picked up his tools and a bucket and began the ascent. The spiral staircase was a narrow stone helix that echoed with his every footstep. Light filtered in through small, slit-like windows, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air. He worked his way up, floor by floor, each level a small, circular room filled with decaying remnants of a forgotten life. Finally, he reached the top. He pushed open a heavy wooden door and stepped into the lantern room. It was a cage of glass and iron, a space that felt suspended between the earth and the sky. The panoramic view was breathtaking, a 360-degree vista of the endless ocean, the jagged coastline, and the distant, toy-like town of Point Judith. The great Fresnel lens, the heart of the lighthouse, sat dormant in the center of the room, its hundreds of prisms coated in a thick film of dust and salt. This room had been a beacon of hope for sailors lost in the dark. For Elias, it felt like the quietest place on earth. He set to work, his movements methodical. While he carefully wiped down the glass panels, Ghost began to explore. The dog circled the room, sniffing every corner. Then, he stopped. He stood over a particular section of the dark wooden floor near the base of the lens mechanism. A low whine escaped his throat. He pawed at the boards once, then looked at Elias. "Just an old mouse nest, boy," Elias said, not turning around. "We'll clear it all out." He continued his work. But Ghost did not move. The whining grew more insistent, and the sound of his claws scraping against the wood became more frantic. Elias sighed and turned. "Ghost, leave it." The dog stopped, but only for a moment. He let out a single sharp bark and resumed his digging, looking over his shoulder at Elias with an expression of such intense, pleading earnestness that it stopped the man in his tracks. Elias knew his dog. This was not playful curiosity. This was an urgent, undeniable message. He put down his cloth and walked over, kneeling beside his companion. He ran his hand over the floorboards. They seemed solid, no different from the others. "What is it?" he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. Ghost whined again and nudged Elias's hand with his wet nose, pushing it firmly against one specific plank. Elias pressed down. The board gave just a fraction of an inch with a faint groan. His heart began to beat a little faster. He went back for his pry bar, slipping the flat edge into the seam. He applied gentle pressure. The old wood resisted, then surrendered with a long, splintering creak. He lifted the plank free. Beneath it was not the dusty subfloor he expected, but a neatly carved, shallow compartment. Lying inside was a rectangular object wrapped carefully in dark, oiled canvas. With a sense of reverence, he lifted the package out. It was heavier than it looked. He set it down and slowly unwrapped the stiff, waterproof cloth. The smell of old leather and aged paper filled the air. Inside were two items. The first was a journal, its dark leather cover worn smooth by time and handling. There was no title, only a simple compass rose embossed in faded gold. The second was a marine compass, but unlike any he had ever seen. It was heavy, made of solid brass, and its glass was thick and beveled. But when he held it level, the needle didn't swing toward magnetic north. It spun lazily once, then settled, pointing steadfastly toward a specific direction out over the sea, unwavering and certain. He sat on the floor of the lantern room, the setting sun casting long shadows around him. Ghost lay beside him, head on his paws, a quiet observer now that his job was done. Elias opened the journal. The pages were filled with a meticulous, elegant script, but it was not simple prose. He saw complex astronomical drawings, hand-drawn nautical charts of the local coastline, and lines of what looked like cryptic code. He saw notations about tides, star alignments, and historical shipwrecks. It was the work of a brilliant, obsessive mind. He read the first entry, dated decades ago. "The sea does not give up its dead," it began, "but it sometimes whispers its secrets to those who know how to listen." As the last light of day bled from the sky, Elias Vance realized he had not just purchased a dilapidated house on a cliff, he had inherited a mystery. His quiet war for peace was over. A new, far more complex campaign had just begun. Miles away from the salt-sprayed cliffs of Point Judith, the world was one of polished steel, dark wood, and hushed, climate-controlled air. Preston Holloway stood before a floor-to-ceiling window in his penthouse office, looking down at the city below. He was a man in his late 50s, though he looked a decade younger, his silver hair perfectly styled, his tailored Italian suit fitting his frame without a single crease. His face was handsome, a mask of smooth, confident charm, but his pale blue eyes held the cold, calculating stillness of a frozen lake. On his expansive desk, among the neat stacks of contracts and architectural models, lay a single, yellowed nautical chart of the Maine coastline. The private line on his desk buzzed softly. He pressed the speaker button. "Yes? Mr. Holloway," a reedy voice said. "The deed was filed this morning, the Point Judith property. It's been sold." In strain, a muscle tightened in Holloway's jaw. He had owned this entire town, figuratively, for years. Every zoning official, every council member, was in his pocket. But the Lighthouse property had remained stubbornly out of reach, protected by the eccentric will of its deceased owner. He had sent his own teams to survey the place years ago, crawling over every inch of the tower and the cottage. They had found nothing but dust and decay. Yet Holloway's gut, the instinct that had built his empire, told him the secret was still there, hidden in plain sight. "To whom?" Holloway asked, his voice dangerously soft. "An individual. One Elias Vance. Seems to be a veteran, paid in cash. No financing. A veteran. A nobody. Perfect." His own brute force methods had failed. The old man had been too clever. But a new owner, living in the space, breathing its air, might just stumble over the tripwire his own men had missed. A new strategy was needed. Patience. "He is to be our bloodhound," Holloway said, more to himself than to the informant. He turned from the window and pressed another button on his console. "Silas, my office." The door opened moments later, and Silas Croft entered. He was the physical antithesis of his boss, a large, heavily built man with a shaved head and a neck as thick as a tree trunk. He moved with a quiet, predatory economy of motion. He wore a simple black jacket and dark pants, functional clothing for a man whose job was to solve problems that couldn't be solved with a pen. Holloway gestured to the chart on his desk. "Our stubborn lighthouse has a new tenant. I want eyes on him, constant. I want to know when he wakes, when he sleeps, what he eats for breakfast. I want to know if he finds so much as a loose floorboard. Do not engage. Do not be seen. Just watch. Let him be the key. When he unlocks the door, you will take it from him." Silas Croft simply nodded, a flicker of understanding in his dark eyes, and left as silently as he had arrived. Back at the lighthouse, Elias was lost in another world. The days bled into one another, measured only by the rising and falling of the tides. The Journal of Arthur Blackwood was his sole obsession. It was a labyrinth of history, astronomy, and personal reflection. Elias, the former signals intelligence specialist, found a familiar rhythm in the work, teasing patterns from the chaos of Arthur's writing. He cross-referenced star charts with tide tables, trying to understand the cryptic diagrams that filled the margins. He was so consumed that at first he didn't notice the subtle changes in his environment. While repairing a shutter on the cottage's exterior, a flash of light from the high cliff road across the cove caught his eye. He squinted, saw nothing but the sun glinting off rock, and thought no more of it. The next day, it happened again. This time, he was sure it was the reflection from a pair of binoculars. He started paying more attention. A black SUV was often parked at the scenic overlook miles down the coast. It was too far away to be threatening, but its presence was constant, a dark, unblinking eye. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, he found a set of footprints in the soft mud at the edge of the woods, bordering his property. They were deep and wide, made by heavy work boots. They were not his. He tried to dismiss it all. He was isolated. His mind, scarred by years of learned hypervigilance, was prone to seeing threats where none existed. This was exactly the kind of paranoia he had come here to escape. But he couldn't explain Ghost. The dog's behavior had transformed. The quiet companion who was content to lie at his feet was gone. Ghost had become a sentry. He spent hours at the edge of the cliff, not looking at the waves, but staring intently at the distant overlook where the SUV so often sat. His body would be tense, the fur along his spine slightly raised. When Elias walked the property line, Ghost would walk with him, not with the easy gait of a pet, but with the focused patrol of a guard. He would stop near the spot where Elias had found the footprints, lower his head, and a low, guttural growl would vibrate in his chest. He would stand there for minutes at a time, a silent, silver-gray statue of warning, his gaze fixed on the tree line. One evening, as Elias sat on his porch reading the journal, Ghost suddenly rose from his resting spot, walked to the edge of the yard, and let out a series of deep, resonant barks aimed at the empty darkness. The sound was not one of excitement. It was a clear, territorial challenge. Elias put the book down. He walked over and stood beside his dog, placing a hand on his strong back. Ghost fell silent. but he didn't relax. He pressed against Elias's leg, a solid, reassuring weight. Elias looked out into the vast, empty night. He could see nothing. He could hear nothing but the wind and the sea. But he trusted the senses of the animal beside him more than he trusted his own desire for peace. The paranoia wasn't in his head. The threat was real. He was being watched. The uneasy truce with the watching darkness lasted 2 days. 2 days of Elias, working with a constant, prickling awareness at the back of his neck, and Ghost maintaining a silent, vigilant perimeter. The need for supplies, however, could not be ignored. He needed lumber to repair the cottage roof, sealant for the windows, and food for himself and the dog. The trip to Point Judith was no longer a simple chore. It was a tactical movement into potentially hostile territory. He left Ghost in the cab of the truck, the window cracked just enough for the dog to breathe the salt air. "Watch our six, buddy," he said, scratching the dog behind the ears. Ghost just whined, his amber eyes fixed on Elias, a silent promise to guard their temporary command post. Elias moved through the town with a purpose that drew quiet attention. He was the stranger, the newcomer who had bought the Blackwood place, a landmark of local curiosity. In the hardware store, he felt the curious glances of the other patrons. He bought his supplies, paid in cash, and loaded them into his truck. But his mission wasn't complete. He needed information, and the best place to find the pulse of a small town was at its heart. The diner was called the Chart Room. It was a cozy place, smelling of fresh coffee, fried bacon, and the faint, briny scent of the harbor. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and old framed photographs of fishing boats and Point Judith in years past hung crookedly. Elias chose a booth by the window, a strategic position that gave him a clear view of the street and the entrance. A woman emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She was in her late 60s, with a cloud of white hair pulled back from a kind, weathered face. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, were crinkled at the corners from a lifetime of smiling, and they held a sharp, intelligent light. She moved with an easy, no-nonsense grace, carrying a coffee pot as if it were an extension of her arm. "Coffee, hun?" she asked, her voice warm and welcoming. "Please," Elias said. She filled his mug. "Haven't seen you in here before. You must be the one who bought old Arthur's place." Elias looked up, surprised by her directness. "Elias Vance. And yes, that's me." "Martha Gable," she said, offering a hand that was firm and calloused from work. "Pleased to meet you. Takes a certain kind of person to want that lighthouse. Most folks are scared of the quiet." "The quiet is what I came for," Elias replied honestly. Martha studied him for a long moment, her gaze perceptive. "Arthur was a friend of mine. A bit of an odd duck, but a good man. The best. He loved that lighthouse more than anything. Talked to it like it was a person. See? It likes his—" This was the opening Elias had been hoping for. "I found some of his old things. A journal. Seems like he was quite a historian." Martha's smile was fond. Historian is one word for it. He was obsessed. Chasing ghosts, most people said. Specifically, the ghost of a ship called the Wanderer. Wrecked in a hurricane back in the 1702nd. Arthur was convinced it went down right off your point, carrying something valuable. Elias felt a jolt of recognition. The name was scrawled all over the journal. "Did he ever find anything?" Martha shook her head, topping off his coffee. "Not that he ever told me. But he was always searching, always convinced he was on the verge of a breakthrough. Said he had to protect its legacy from the sharks." The word hung in the air between them. "Sharks?" Elias asked, keeping his voice neutral. The warmth in Martha's expression cooled slightly, replaced by a look of stern caution. She leaned a little closer, lowering her voice. "You seem like a good man, Mr. Vance, so I'll give you some free advice. There are sharks on the land, too. For years, a man named Preston Holloway has been trying to get his hands on that property. He's a big-time developer from the city, thinks he can buy the whole coastline." Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The name. "He made Arthur's last years miserable," Martha continued, her voice laced with old anger. lowball offers, then threats, disguised as legal notices. He's pressured other folks around here too. Tries to scare them into selling cheap. A real shark in a suit, that one. If he finds out you're living there, he'll come sniffing around. Be careful of him. It was happening. In his mind, the pieces slammed into place with the force of a rifle bolt locking into battery. The glint of binoculars from the cliff, the black SUV at the overlook, the footprints in the mud. It wasn't random. It wasn't his paranoia. It was a calculated campaign of surveillance. And the man behind it, the invisible, watching shadow, now had a name: Preston Holloway. Elias looked out the window at the quiet street. It didn't look so quiet anymore. It looked like the edge of a battlefield. The enemy he had been sensing now had a face, a name, and a clear motive. He finished his coffee, the warmth doing nothing to chase away the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He paid his bill, leaving a generous tip. "Thank you, Martha," he said, his voice low and serious. "That's the most valuable thing I've gotten all week." There was a look of understanding in her eyes. She simply nodded. "You take care of yourself out there. And that beautiful dog of yours. Arthur would have liked that you have a dog." Elias walked back to his truck, the weight of his purchases seeming insignificant compared to the weight of the new reality. He opened the door and was met by Ghost's anxious, questioning gaze. He rested his hand on the dog's head, the thick fur, a familiar comfort. "Well, boy," he whispered, starting the engine. "We know his name." The knowledge of a named enemy changed everything. The quiet, therapeutic rhythm of Elias's days vanished, replaced by the taut, focused urgency of a mission. Sleep became a necessary inconvenience, food, a fuel. He worked day and night, the lantern in the keeper's cottage burning into the small hours of the morning. He now understood he was in a race, and his opponent, Preston Holloway, had a significant head start. He pored over Arthur Blackwood's journal again and again, but the text offered no more direct clues. The secrets, Elias became convinced, were not just on paper. They were embedded in the lighthouse itself, hidden with a patience and ingenuity that a corporate goon squad would never possess. Holloway's men had likely searched this place with impatience, looking for a chest or a safe, something obvious. Arthur Blackwood was not an obvious man. He was a man who thought in layers, in puzzles. Elias's attention turned completely to the heart of the tower, the massive, beautiful, and silent clockwork mechanism designed to turn the great lens. It was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, a complex ballet of brass gears, heavy counterweights, and polished steel drive shafts. It was the one thing in the lighthouse that was both incredibly complex and absolutely essential to its function. It was the perfect hiding place. He decided the first step was to see if he could make it work. For 2 days, he meticulously cleaned and oiled every component, his movements precise and economical. He was no longer just a handyman. He was a specialist, his old signals intelligence training resurfacing as he analyzed the intricate system, understanding how each piece connected to the whole. Finally, the moment came. He released the brake on the primary counterweight. With a deep, resonant groan, the machine came to life. The great gears began to turn, their brass teeth meshing with a series of satisfying clicks and whirs. The sound was immense, filling the lantern room with the powerful, rhythmic heartbeat of a bygone era. Ghost, who had been lying calmly in a patch of sunlight, shot to his feet. As the mechanism's speed increased, a high-pitched screech began to emanate from a large gear cluster near the base. The smell of old, heated oil and grinding metal filled the air. The dog began to pant, his body trembling. He whined, a high, anxious sound that was almost lost in the mechanical symphony. Elias watched him, concerned. "It's all right, boy. Just old." But Ghost was not just nervous. He was focused. He approached the groaning machine, his ears flat against his head. He ignored the larger, louder gears and went directly to the source of the screeching. He nudged Elias's leg with his nose, then nudged the heavy iron housing that covered the gear cluster. He looked up at Elias, his amber eyes wide with distress. This wasn't a general fear of the noise. It was a specific, targeted complaint. Trusting his partner implicitly, Elias re-engaged the brake. The mechanism wound down with a final, shuddering sigh. Silence returned, broken only by the wind and Ghost's soft whining. Elias knelt, running his hand along the dog's back to soothe him. "Show me," he said softly. Ghost nudged the iron housing again. Elias unlatched the heavy cover and swung it open, revealing a complex web of interlocking gears. He examined them one by one. They were all covered in the same patina of age, the same film of old grease. Nothing seemed out of place. He was about to close the cover when he remembered his training. Never look for what is there. Look for what isn't. Look for the anomaly. He ran his fingers over the teeth of each gear, feeling the worn metal. Then, on the largest brass cog in the cluster, his thumb snagged on something. He leaned closer, his eyes inches from the surface. There, along the seam where the gear's face was joined to its hub, were a series of incredibly faint scratches, almost invisible against the aged brass. They were tool marks, but not from any standard wrench. They were the subtle signature of a custom tool, made for a secret purpose. Holloway's men, looking for a handle or a hinge, would never have seen it. His breath caught. He spent the next hour carefully studying the gear, discovering a tiny, almost seamless pressure release pin hidden in one of the spokes. When he finally pressed it with the tip of a screwdriver, there was a soft click. The face of the gear loosened. It wasn't a solid piece of brass, it was a cap. With trembling hands, he worked the cap free. Inside, just as the summary had hinted, the gear had been hollowed out. Nestled in the void was a small cylindrical object wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. He gently lifted it out. The package was light, almost weightless. He unwrapped it carefully, the oilskin crinkling in the quiet room. Inside was a single, tightly rolled piece of parchment. It was not a letter or a map of the land. As he unrolled it, he saw the familiar, meticulous hand of Arthur Blackwood. It was a star chart, but unique and strange, filled with constellations he did not recognize and trajectories that seemed to defy known celestial mechanics. He looked from the intricate drawing to Ghost, who was now sitting calmly beside him, his tongue lolling in a silent, happy pant. The dog's job was done. Elias reached out and wrapped his arm around the dog's powerful neck, burying his face in the thick gray fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You found it. It is forming?" Nope. They had the next piece of the puzzle. It was a piece Holloway did not have, a secret the brute force of his greed could never uncover. It was a secret whispered by a ghost and found by a dog. The lantern room became Elias's command center. For days he lived and breathed the mystery, sleeping on a cot beside the great lens, with Ghost a constant, watchful presence. The star chart was spread across the floor, weighted down at its corners with old tools. To an untrained eye, it was a beautiful but nonsensical piece of art. To Elias, it was a complex cipher, and the kind of challenge his mind had been trained to dismantle. He applied the skills he had learned in the quiet, tense rooms of signals intelligence. He looked for patterns, for repetitions, for anomalies. He quickly confirmed his initial theory. This was no map of the heavens. The constellations were subtly wrong, the distances between the stars mathematically impossible. It was a map of the seabed, a brilliant piece of coded cartography. The stars were underwater pinnacles, the nebulae were treacherous reefs, and the graceful arcs of comets were the paths of deep-sea currents. Arthur Blackwood had painted a portrait of the ocean floor and disguised it as the night sky. But the map alone was a lock without a key. Frustrated, Elias turned back to the other artifacts. He picked up the heavy brass compass again, turning it over in his hands. It felt too complex for a simple directional tool. He found a small, almost invisible seam and, using the tip of his knife, managed to pry the bottom plate off. Inside, nestled in a velvet lining, was a small, precisely ground lens. His mind raced back to a passage in the journal he had dismissed as poetic flourish. On the darkest night, the light itself will reveal the truth. He looked at the great lamp of the lighthouse, then at the lens in his hand, then at the chart on the floor. The pieces fell into place with a sudden, stunning clarity. The journal also spoke repeatedly of the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. It was all there. The lighthouse was the projector. The lens was the focus. The chart was the screen. And the winter solstice was the date when the celestial alignment and perhaps the angle of the moon would make the projection perfect. He now knew how to find the wanderer. He just had to wait for the right night. Patience was a virtue Elias had in abundance. Preston Holloway did not. In his gleaming office, Holloway listened to the tinny voice of Silas Croft on the speakerphone. "Nothing," Silas reported, his voice gravelly with frustration. "He cleans, he fixes things, he takes the dog for walks. He spends hours up in the lantern room, but from my position, I can't see what he's doing. If he's found something, he's not acting like it." Holloway drummed his fingers on his polished desk. His bloodhound was proving to be frustratingly slow. The time for passive observation was over. It was time to rattle the cage. "The time for watching is over, Silas," Holloway said, his voice cold and sharp. "Go in. I don't care how you do it. Find out what he knows. Find out what he has found. Tonight." That evening, a fragile peace had settled over the lighthouse. Elias was downstairs in the small kitchen, heating a can of soup on the gas stove. He was tired, but filled with a quiet sense of triumph. He had solved Arthur's puzzle. Ghost was lying on the rug near the door, seemingly asleep. The only sounds were the gentle hiss of the stove and the distant murmur of the tide. Then, Ghost moved. It was not a gradual awakening. One moment he was sleeping, the next he was on his feet, silent and rigid. A low growl, like the sound of distant thunder, vibrated from deep in his chest. His head was lowered, his eyes fixed on the cottage door. The fur on his back stood on end. Elias instantly abandoned the stove, his body moving without conscious thought. He grabbed the heaviest tool he had nearby, a solid iron tire iron. He didn't make a sound, simply moved into the shadows of the room, his back against the wall, his gaze locked on the door. He trusted Ghost's warning as much as he would trust a report from his most reliable field operative. The old doorknob began to turn, slowly, silently. Then, with a sudden violent crack, the wooden door frame splintered and the door flew open. Silas Croft filled the doorway, a crowbar in one hand, his large frame silhouetted against the night. But the surprise was his. He expected a startled, confused man. He did not expect the room to be dark, nor did he expect the immediate, explosive reaction. Before Silas could take a second step, a gray and white blur of fury shot out of the darkness. Ghost launched himself, not at Silas's legs, but at the arm holding the crowbar, his powerful jaws clamping down. Silas roared in pain and surprise, stumbling back, shaking his arm violently to dislodge the dog. That was the opening Elias needed. He moved from the shadows, his attack swift and precise. He brought the tire iron down in a hard, disabling strike against Silas's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the crowbar clattered to the floor. Silas bellowed again, this time a scream of pure agony, clutching his shattered wrist. The fight was over before it had truly begun. It was a brief, brutal collision of violence in the small, quiet room. Silas, a bully used to intimidating his victims, was utterly unprepared for the coordinated, ferocious defense of a trained soldier and his fiercely loyal canine partner. He stared at Elias with eyes wide with shock and pain, then at the snarling dog, still holding its ground. He scrambled backward out the door and disappeared into the night. Elias slammed the broken door shut and wedged a chair under the knob. His heart was pounding, adrenaline singing in his veins. He knelt and ran a hand over Ghost's head, checking him for injuries. The dog was fine, licking his chops, a low growl still rumbling in his throat. The quiet sanctuary was quiet no longer. Its peace had been irrevocably shattered. Elias looked at the splintered door frame and then out into the oppressive darkness. The game was no longer about watching. It was about survival. And Silas Croft had left one thing behind besides his crowbar. A clear, unspoken threat. He would be back. The first warning came over the crackling static of the battery-powered weather radio. A nor'easter, the announcer's grave voice had said. A monster of a storm churning up the coast, promising hurricane-force winds and a torrential downpour. Elias looked out the window. The sky was a bruised, ominous gray, and the sea had transformed from a gentle murmur into a restless, white-capped snarl. He knew what a storm like this meant. Out here on this exposed finger of rock. Isolation, complete and total. He spent the rest of the day preparing for the siege. He boarded up the windows of the cottage, hammered loose shingles back into place on the roof, and carried extra firewood inside. He worked with a grim, methodical efficiency, every action deliberate. Ghost stayed at his heels, a silent shadow, his usual calm replaced by a low-level anxiety that mirrored the dropping barometric pressure. The dog could feel the coming violence in the air. As dusk fell, the storm hit. It came not as rain, but as a solid wall of wind and water that slammed into the lighthouse with the force of a physical blow. The old stone tower groaned under the assault. The wind shrieked through the eaves and tiny cracks in the masonry, a high, keening sound like something in agony. For Elias, the sounds were horribly familiar. The percussive blast of waves against the cliffside sounded like mortar fire. The high shriek of the wind was the sound of incoming rockets. The battle he had been fighting in the quiet corners of his mind was suddenly all around him, given voice and fury by the storm. He sat in the dim light of the lantern, his fists clenched as memories clawed at the edges of his vision. The grit of desert sand in his teeth, the smell of cordite, the faces of men he had lost. He was back there, in the chaos, his carefully constructed peace washed away by the deluge. He felt a wet nose press insistently against his hand. He looked down into Ghost's steady, amber eyes. The dog whined softly, not in fear of the storm, but in concern for his human. The simple, grounding touch was an anchor. Elias took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing himself back to the present. He was not in the desert. He was in Maine. He was in his home. And he was not alone. He had a duty. He had to protect his partner. At the height of the storm's fury, a sound different from the wind's howl echoed from the floor below. A sharp, splintering crack. A window breaking. Ghost was on his feet in an instant, a savage growl ripping from his chest as he positioned himself between Elias and the door leading to the tower. Elias's training took over, his internal storm instantly silenced by the clarity of a real and present threat. He grabbed the heavy tire iron. He knew Croft would be back. He knew a man like that, humiliated and injured, would not let it go, and he knew a storm like this provided the perfect cover for violence. The cottage door creaked open, and a large figure wrapped in dark, waterproof gear stepped inside, rain and wind blasting in with him. It was Silas Croft. His left wrist was crudely splinted, and his face was a mask of cold, vengeful rage. He held a heavy flashlight, like a club in his good hand. Elias didn't wait. He kicked the small kitchen table into Croft's path and retreated through the door into the base of the lighthouse, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. He heard Croft roar in frustration as he smashed through the table. The hunt was on. He took to the spiral stairs, taking them two at a time. His only advantage was terrain. The narrow, winding staircase was a fatal funnel, a place where Croft's superior size and strength would be a liability. Ghost moved ahead of him, a silent gray scout in the darkness. The battle became a deadly game of cat and mouse, played out in the vertical confines of the tower. Elias would wait in the darkness of one of the small circular rooms, lashing out with the tire iron as Croft ascended, then retreating upwards again before the larger man could recover. Croft, roaring in fury, would charge up after him, the beam of his flashlight cutting wildly through the oppressive dark. The fight culminated 3 floors up, in a small room once used for storing oil. Croft, anticipating Elias's tactic, threw his heavy flashlight at Elias's head. Elias ducked, but the flashlight shattered against the stone wall, plunging the room into absolute blackness. Croft lunged, using the moment of disorientation to his advantage. He crashed into Elias, his sheer weight and power pinning the smaller man against the curved stone wall. Elias fought back, but Croft was fueled by a furious desperation. He felt his air being cut off as Croft's forearm pressed against his throat. His vision began to swim with black spots. He was losing. His strength was failing. It was in that moment, in the suffocating darkness, that the room exploded. From the blackest corner of the room, Ghost launched himself. He had been waiting, silent and patient, for this exact moment. He hit Croft's side like 150 pounds of canine fury, his jaws finding their mark in the man's shoulder. The attack was savage and utterly unexpected. Croft screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony and terror. His grip on Elias instantly released. The opening was all Elias needed. He pushed away from the wall, gasping for air, and brought his knee up, with all his remaining strength, into Croft's side. The larger man doubled over with a grunt of pain, trying to fight off the dog still attached to his shoulder. Elias swung the tire iron in a short, brutal arc, connecting solidly with the side of Croft's head. Silas Croft crumpled to the stone floor and did not move. Silence descended, broken only by Elias's ragged gasps for breath, Ghost's low growls, and the unabated roar of the storm outside. He stood over his vanquished enemy, his body screaming with pain, but his mind sharp and clear. He had faced the storm, both inside and out, and he had won. He knelt down, his hand finding his partner in the dark. "Good boy," he breathed, his voice choked with gratitude and exhaustion. "Good boy, Ghost." The world after the storm was unnervingly still. Dawn revealed a landscape scrubbed clean, the air sharp and tasting of salt and wet earth. Inside the tower, Elias finished checking the ropes that bound Silas Croft, who was still unconscious on the cold stone floor. The man was a liability, a problem that needed a proper solution, but as Elias looked at the defeated intruder, he felt no triumph, only a grim certainty. Croft was just a tool, a weapon sent by an unseen hand. The real war was with the man who wielded him. His first priority was Ghost. He carefully examined the dog, his gentle hands probing for any injuries. Ghost was unharmed, save for a small cut on his lip, which he endured, being cleaned with a patient lick to Elias's hand. The quiet moment of care was a silent conversation, an acknowledgement of the debt Elias now owed his partner. With the phone line still down, Elias used a satellite phone from his old gear to contact the Point Judith Sheriff's Department. His report was brief, calm, and professional, stripped of all emotion. Break-in, hostile intruder. Intruder subdued and detained. He gave his location and ended the call. An hour later, a lone SUV with the county sheriff's insignia made its way carefully up the muddy track to the lighthouse. A man in his 50s with a weary face and a thick graying mustache stepped out. This was Sheriff Brody. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had seen too much trouble in his small town to be surprised by anything. He took in the scene with a practiced eye, the boarded windows, the broken door of the cottage, Elias standing calm but alert, and finally, the large unconscious man tied up inside. "That's Silas Croft," Brody said, his voice a tired rumble. "Holloway's boy. Knew he'd cause real trouble one day." As his deputy processed the scene and loaded Croft into the vehicle, Sheriff Brody turned to Elias. "Son, I'm taking him in, and we'll charge him with everything we can. But you need to understand something. Preston Holloway owns half the lawyers in this state. This man, Croft, will be out on bail by tomorrow, and Holloway will claim you attacked him. You're stirring up a nest you might not be prepared for." His self. It wasn't a threat, but a piece of weary, honest advice. It confirmed what Elias already knew. He couldn't win this fight through official channels alone. He needed allies. After the sheriff left, Elias cleaned himself up, his body aching from the fight. He put the precious journal and the star chart into a waterproof bag, then looked at Ghost. "Come on, boy. We're going to see a friend." He drove straight to the chart room. It was early, and the diner was quiet. Martha Gable was behind the counter, polishing glasses. She saw him enter, and the friendly smile on her face vanished, replaced by a look of deep concern. She took in his bruised cheek and the grim set of his jaw. "The storm was rough on you," she said, her voice low. "The storm wasn't the problem," Elias replied. He sat in the same booth as before. Without a word, Martha put a closed sign on the door and brought over 2 mugs of coffee. Elias opened his bag and laid everything on the table between them: the journal, the strange compass, the star chart. Then he told her everything. He spoke in the same clipped, factual tone he had used with the sheriff, detailing the surveillance, the first attack, and the life-or-death battle during the storm. Martha listened without interruption, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. She reached out and gently touched the cover of Arthur's journal. "That poor, brilliant man," she whispered. "He really found it. And that monster Holloway knew." Her gaze met Elias's, and in her eyes he saw not pity, but a fierce, protective fire. "Arthur was my friend. This isn't just your fight anymore, Elias." She stood, walked to the phone behind the counter, and dialed a number from memory. "Ben? It's Aunt Martha. How soon can you get to Point Judith?" "Yes, it's important, very important." Ben Carter arrived 3 hours later. He was a man in his late 30s, dressed in a sharp city suit that looked out of place in the rustic diner. But beneath the polished exterior was the same intelligent, no-nonsense light Elias had seen in his aunt's eyes. He shook Elias's hand firmly, his gaze direct and assessing. They convened in Martha's small back office. Elias told the story again, this time with Ben asking sharp, insightful questions. The lawyer examined the artifacts with a growing sense of excitement, his professional skepticism melting away as he recognized the potential significance of what lay before him. "This is incredible," Ben said, looking at the star chart. "Arthur Blackwood wasn't just a historian, he was a genius. This is a legitimate discovery claim." He began to pace the small office, his mind working quickly. "Okay," he said, stopping to face Elias. "Sheriff Brody is a good man, but he's right. Holloway will try to bury us in legal paperwork and tie this up in court for years. We can't fight him on his terms. We have to fight him on ours. We need to open a war on 2 fronts. He held up a finger. "Front 1 is offensive. The secret. I'm going to drive to the Capitol tonight and file a confidential, preemptive salvage claim for the wreck of the Wanderer in your name, using Arthur Blackwood's documented research as primary evidence. We get our claim in the system legally and quietly before Holloway even knows what's happening. We take the prize off the table." He held up a second finger. "Front 2 is defensive. The harassment. You and Martha are going to write down everything. Every time you saw the SUV, every footprint, every threat. We'll document the damage to your home, get photos of your injuries. We are going to build a rock-solid case for assault, trespassing, and a pattern of intimidation. We use this to get a restraining order and to countersue if he tries anything." Elias looked from the energetic lawyer to the steadfast diner owner. For the first time since this ordeal began, he didn't feel alone. He had a team, a small, unlikely alliance forged in a small-town diner, ready to take on an empire. He looked down at Ghost, who was resting his head on his knee, a silent, furry anchor. The dog looked up, and for a moment, Elias felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Preston Holloway's world was built on control. When his lawyer called, that control shattered. The news was delivered in the clipped, sterile tones of legal defeat. Silas Croft had been denied bail. Worse, a maritime salvage claim for a wreck known as the Wanderer had been filed that morning by a top firm in Portland, citing research from the estate of Arthur Blackwood. The claimant was Elias Vance. The legal avenues were closed. The prize was about to be snatched from his grasp. Decades of obsession, of patient waiting, had amounted to nothing. The cold, calculated mask Holloway wore for the world finally cracked, revealing the raw, ugly greed beneath. He had tried subtlety. He had tried intimidation. Now, all that was left was brute force. He made a single phone call, his voice a low snarl of command. "Get the men. We're ending this tonight." At the lighthouse, an uneasy quiet had settled. Elias had spent the day preparing, not for a storm of wind and rain, but one of violence. He worked with the focused intensity of a soldier fortifying a position. He had jammed the lower windows with heavy timbers, barricaded the cottage door from the inside, and prepared his real defense in the tower itself. He trusted Ben Carter's legal strategy, but his training had taught him to never rely on a plan that was out of his hands. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Night fell, thick and starless. The first sign of the attack was not a sound, but a sudden, jarring silence. The low hum of the generator powering his laptop died. He checked his satellite phone. No signal. They had cut the lines and were using a jammer. Before the thought could even fully form, Ghost rose from his spot by the tower door, a low, ominous growl starting deep in his chest. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy tire iron and a powerful flashlight, extinguished the lantern, and moved with Ghost into the deep shadows of the tower's base. They were coming. He heard them first, the crunch of multiple sets of boots on the gravel outside. Then, a splintering crash as they forced their way into the cottage. Shouted commands echoed in the night. They would find the cottage empty and realize their target was in the tower. The assault on the tower door began. It was a heavy, ancient oak door, and Elias had reinforced it with an iron bar. It held for a few precious minutes against their furious assault before the hinges finally tore from the stone with a scream of tortured metal. 3 men, armed and dressed in black, spilled into the base of the tower, led by Holloway himself, his handsome face twisted into an ugly sneer. "Vance!" Holloway shouted, his voice echoing up the spiral stairs. "There is nowhere to run. Give me the journal and the chart, and I might let you walk away from this." Elias's reply was the sound of a heavy wooden crate tumbling down the stairs, crashing into the lead man, and sending him sprawling. The battle for the lighthouse had begun. What followed was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. Elias, with his intimate knowledge of the structure and his military training, turned the tower into a vertical death trap. He used the narrow winding stairs to create bottlenecks, forcing the armed men to advance one at a time into the waiting darkness. He had set up simple but effective tripwires, ropes tied to stacks of old paint cans that would crash down, creating noise and confusion. He and Ghost worked as a seamless unit. Elias would strike from the shadows of a landing, using his strength and the element of surprise to disable an opponent, while Ghost would appear from another direction, a gray phantom of snarling teeth, distracting and disorienting them. They were outnumbered, but they were fighting on their home turf, a fortress of stone and shadow. They repelled the first 2 attempts to ascend, sending the henchmen retreating in disarray to the base of the tower. Holloway's voice, now raw with fury, echoed from below. "He's one man. Get up there and finish it." Fueled by their boss's rage, the remaining 2 men and Holloway himself began the final, desperate push. They moved more carefully now, checking for traps, advancing as a unit. Elias and Ghost were forced to retreat upwards, floor by floor, the space to maneuver shrinking with every step. The final confrontation took place, as it was always meant to, in the lantern room at the very top. Elias made his last stand there, the great glass lens at his back, the churning black ocean visible on all sides. He was trapped, cornered. Ghost stood beside him, hackles raised, a defiant growl rumbling in his chest. The door burst open. Holloway and his 2 remaining men stormed in, fanning out to surround him. Holloway's face was flushed with victory, his eyes gleaming with a manic light. "It's over, Vance," he spat, stepping forward. "A valiant effort, truly. But it ends now. Give me what is mine." Elias stood his ground, his grip tight on the tire iron. He was bruised, exhausted, and out of options. He looked at Ghost, and the dog looked back, ready to fight to the last breath for him. He would not fail him. It was in that tense, final moment, as Holloway's men began to close in, that the night outside suddenly exploded with light and sound. The piercing wail of police sirens cut through the air, growing rapidly closer. Red and blue lights flashed across the glass panels of the lantern room, painting the dramatic tableau in strobing, frantic colors. Holloway froze, his face a mask of utter disbelief. He spun around to look out the window, seeing a convoy of sheriff's vehicles swarming the base of his lighthouse. "How?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Elias allowed himself a grim, tired smile. Ben Carter's plan had worked. The lawyer, anticipating Holloway's violent move, had already been in contact with Sheriff Brody. The moment Elias's satellite phone went dead, it was the pre-arranged signal. The police were not responding to a call, they were springing a trap. Holloway stared at Elias, the realization dawning on his face. He hadn't been hunting a lone, broken man. He had been chasing a soldier who had led him straight into a perfectly executed ambush. As the sound of deputies storming the tower echoed from below, Elias stood tall, bruised but unbroken, with his loyal partner growling softly at his side, the flashing lights of justice finally reflecting in their eyes. The flashing lights of justice painted the lantern room in strokes of red and blue, illuminating the scene of a war that had finally ended. In the aftermath, the lighthouse became a hub of calm, official activity. Sheriff Brody took Elias's statement, his weary eyes holding a newfound respect. Ben Carter arrived before dawn, his city suit looking out of place but his presence a shield of legal authority, ensuring every detail was documented correctly. Preston Holloway and his men were taken away in handcuffs, their arrogant bluster replaced by the sullen silence of defeat. The arrest was only the beginning. As Ben had predicted, the violent assault on Elias was the thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire tapestry of Holloway's corrupt empire. The investigation into the attack led to probes of his business dealings, uncovering years of fraud, extortion, and bribery. His assets were frozen, his political allies scattered, and his carefully constructed world crumbled into dust. Justice, when it finally arrived, was swift and absolute. A few months later, under the watchful eye of state historians and maritime experts, the salvage operation for the Wanderer began. Elias watched from the cliffside, a mug of coffee warming his hands, with Martha beside him and Ghost resting his head on his knee. A large salvage vessel was anchored over the coordinates revealed by Arthur Blackwood's ingenious puzzle. They did not find chests of gold. The treasure of the Wanderer was far more precious. Divers brought up remarkably well-preserved artifacts from the 18th century. Bronze sextants, personal letters sealed in wax, a ship's bell with the name The Wanderer still clearly visible. It was a time capsule, a priceless piece of American maritime history. As the legal discoverer, Elias received a substantial financial reward, a sum that guaranteed he would never have to worry about money again. But as he looked at the pieces of a long-lost story being brought into the light, he knew the real reward was not the money. It was the vindication of a good man's lifelong quest. With his future secure, Elias found a new purpose rising within him. The first project was the lighthouse itself. He hired a team of local craftsmen, men from Point Judith, whose families had lived by the sea for generations. He didn't just repair the lighthouse, he restored it with love and respect. The crumbling stone was repointed, the ironwork stripped of rust and repainted a gleaming black, and the great Fresnel lens was meticulously cleaned until its hundreds of prisms sparkled like diamonds. He transformed the keeper's cottage from a battered shelter into a true home, warm and welcoming. But he did not keep the ground floor of the tower for himself. He turned it into a small, beautifully curated museum, free to the public. He dedicated it to the memory of Arthur Blackwood. Inside, he displayed copies of Arthur's research, the story of the Wanderer, and a plaque that honored the quiet, brilliant historian who had protected its legacy. The lighthouse was no longer just his home. It was a beacon for the town's history. One autumn afternoon, he was walking with Martha through a local animal shelter. He had come to make a donation. As he walked past the rows of kennels, looking into the eyes of the hopeful, lonely dogs, an idea began to form. He stopped in front of a cage holding a young German shepherd with sad, intelligent eyes. The dog reminded him so much of a younger ghost. He thought of his own journey, of the silent, unwavering support of the animal who had stood by him, who had faced down his nightmares and his enemies without question. He knew with absolute clarity what his new legacy must be. He used the majority of his reward to establish a charitable foundation. He called it the Ghost Project. Its mission was simple but profound: to rescue shepherd and other intelligent breeds from high-kill shelters and train them to become certified therapy and support companions for veterans suffering from the same invisible wounds he carried. It was a way to honor his partner and save others like himself, forging new bonds between lonely soldiers and loyal souls. The final scene of his long war came a year later. The lighthouse stood proud and whole, its lamp now lit with a warm, symbolic glow every evening. The museum was a beloved local landmark, and the Ghost Project had already placed its first 5 dogs with veterans across the state. Elias stood on the newly built balcony of the lantern room, leaning against the railing as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery colors. The air was cool and clean. He was no longer the gaunt, haunted man who had arrived a year ago. The rugged lines of his face had softened, and his eyes, once filled with a constant, weary vigilance, were now calm and clear. He felt a familiar weight press against his leg. He looked down and smiled, scratching Ghost behind the ears. The dog looked up at him, his amber eyes full of a deep, abiding love. They stood there together, the soldier and his guardian, watching the endless, peaceful sea. Elias had come to the coast, seeking solitude, to escape his ghosts. Instead, he had found a community, a purpose, and a fight that had healed him. He had learned that the greatest treasures are not hidden under the sea, but in the bonds we forge and the good we build. He had found his peace, not in the quiet of isolation, but in the light he could now share with others. He was finally home. In the end, we learn that the truest compass is not one that points north, but one that points to a loyal heart. The bond between Elias and Ghost reminds us that healing often begins with a wet nose, a trusting gaze, and a love that asks for nothing in return. If their journey of finding peace resonated with you, you can help their story travel further by sharing it with others. We would be so honored if you left a comment below to tell us about the loyal companion who has been a beacon in your life. To continue celebrating these incredible bonds, we hope you'll join our community by subscribing, and your next story of courage is already waiting for you, right here on the screen.